What I want to try to do this morning really is think about this idea of how in the process of reducing dependence on services and on institutions, we can increase interdependence in community life. I was in Sweden a couple of weeks ago and I spoke to quite a number of social workers and they said to me at the end of my presentation, "You're devaluing the contribution of institutions." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm just heckling them." Because to an extent, that whole process of reducing the dependency that people have on our institutional solutions is just one step, isn't it? In Sweden, they told me that, well, 20 years ago, we shut down all the institutions. And I said, "You did. And then you sent people to live lonely lives in places that you called communities that you never built." And that upsets people when they hear that, because nobody wants to do something that doesn't create a good life for the people that they serve. But I think there's something about, as well as being adventurous, being brave in recognizing that the past does not have to define the future, but we do have to learn from it. And many people who we have said have lived independent, self-directed lives have effectively lived lives of loneliness in atomized, disconnected places. And I think our central challenge is not just to figure out how to do self-directed support, but how to build communities of hospitality that have a genuine place of welcome for the people who've been pushed furthest to the edge, with their gifts at the center as community builders in their own right. I think that's the challenge before us. And what I'd like to do, given that we're talking about community, is try to build a little bit of a sense of community in this room, if I can. One of the great enemies of community building is like-mindedness. You know, if you've been sitting in your office or in your life generally with the same person who's been with you for the last 25 years, do not be surprised at all if you're not having any new thoughts. The challenge in building community, one of the great promises of community, is diversity. We build communities on Facebook and we build communities at work and we build communities in all kinds of different places which have been designed intentionally to filter out difference, because we're kind of scared of difference. And so communities of place are the great potential because they allow us not to filter everything out, to actually take some risks around being in diverse, uncontrolled, civic free space. So all of that as a lead-in, what I'd like you to do is find two people in the room you don't know. Get yourself into a group of 3, and then I'll tell you what I have planned for you. So if you've had a chance to say hi, let me explain to you what I think we might do. And there's a real intention behind this aside from being a fun exercise. My sense is, given that we're talking about building community today, we should try and live into that rather than talk into that. I don't know that we're going to think our way into one community. I think we're going to act our way into it. We're going to practice our way into it. If we want to change our practice, we have to practice the change, right? So part of that is not behaving like institutional people, not thinking that self-directed support is an institutional reform agenda. It's not. You will not commission this. You will not reform your systems to make this happen. This is a social movement driven in free space by free people who define themselves not as clients of your services, but as citizens in a democracy. So part of that is just actually getting over ourselves and having fun. Inside every public servant is a citizen waiting to be liberated. So let's act like that's the case. Let's act like we can actually self-direct ourselves as opposed to asking for permission within the context of rules that never allow us to create anything. So let's just talk to each other, because that could be the most radical revolutionary act of all. We're told that we need to occupy Wall Street. Well, maybe we need to occupy our street. So let's occupy this conversation. This will date some of the people in the room, so don't answer if you don't want people to know your age. But how many people remember the iconic movie, The Great Escape? Good. It's a wonderful movie, wonderful soundtrack, and basically for those who haven't seen the movie, it's a movie about 50 prisoners of war in a Nazi prison camp. And what's interesting about the movie is essentially it's a celebration of people's giftedness. In a very, very difficult set of circumstances, people, not just in terms of their own individual gifts, but collectively figure out how to self-direct and collectively direct the outcome they want, using all kinds of creative things. Now, if you haven't watched the movie for a while, I would encourage you to do so, maybe even over the weekend if you have time. And at the end of the movie, you'll see that the credit roll, where they list the various roles that the actors play, is completely different than any other movie you will have ever seen, from Hollywood to Bollywood. Because what it does is it doesn't credit the actors by their professional designation. So it doesn't say Steve McQueen, private or general, doesn't give him any kind of title, doesn't give him any kind of credential. What it says instead is, for each of the people that partook in the Great Escape, these are the gifts they used. So everybody is credited by their gift. The mole, the ferret, the planner, the distractor, the mischief maker. That's what's lifted up. That's what was made most important. And that seems to me to be a really profound insight. That it's not our professional designation that gets us a life of our own choosing, but the gifts that we use in connection with other people's gifts. So what I thought would be kind of fun to do is to invite you to imagine that you're a character in The Great Escape, okay? And this is just a bit of fun, so if there are any method actors in the room, please, leave it outside the door. What we want you to do is just have a bit of fun. And just imagine, if you were a character in that movie, what do you think the credits would say about you? What gift would you use, do you think, that would, in that situation, get you out of prison? If that's what you want. Some people might kind of be quite comfortable in that environment, but most people wouldn't. So just for a bit of fun, and as a way of getting to know some folk that you don't know, just imagine yourself into that for a few minutes, and let's have a conversation that's possibly very different than most conversations you'd have at a conference like this. Enjoy. You didn't see that coming, did you? Sounds like a really good conversation. I've got a microphone here, and I just want to try and encourage some audience participation. But genuinely, even though it was quite a light-hearted exercise in one way, why do you think I did what I did, aside from trying to add an extra 15 minutes onto the presentation? Why was that way of starting a conversation about self-directed support significant? Because I think it is significant. Any thoughts? Let me bring a microphone to you, and if you could just say who you are, that'd be really helpful.
Hi, I'm Dawn from Grampian Opportunities.
Hi, Dawn.
Helps you to think about the skills you can bring rather than, about your role.
Exactly. And why is starting the conversation with a focus on people's skills and on their gifts intentionally, as opposed to starting it around people's roles or their needs, important, do you think? Why does that matter? Thank you.
Phil Darcy, I'm a volunteer. Because it's confidence. They have the confidence at that point. They're talking about themselves and the things they can do as opposed to things they might or might not do.
Absolutely. And I think that's really significant, isn't it? In an awful lot of helping relationships, the reason people don't have power is because the helper is the one with the power. Any other thoughts about why that exercise was important, or indeed starting with people's gifts as a focus is important to today's conversation? Yeah. Alistair.
Alistair from Inspire. Yeah, I just wondered whether you were trying to intentionally break the pattern of conferences. You give a speech, you think about something, you start us off, in a practical way, change the thinking, change the institution, even here. Was that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Alistair. Absolutely. And it's so important, isn't it? We frame almost everything these days in two ways. One, we talk about institutional reform, right? Institutions don't need to reform, they need to refunction. Form follows function. Most institutions don't know what their function is. You can't know what your function is until you first know what your limits are. You've got to know what you're not going to do as much as what you are going to do. And one of the reasons we're here today is because institutions have lost sight of their limits, what they can't do, what they're incompetent to do. And so they've moved for years, decades in Europe, into the space that's called our life, our way, and have tried to create a life when the most an institution could do is provide a program or a service. So absolutely, I agree, Alistair, that what we were trying to do there was think about community alternatives to institutional ways. I think an awful lot of SDS is still thinking about the program. How do we make this into a better program? We still think that the solution resides within the institution. It's just that we have to dance a different dance. But actually, the truth is, it doesn't rely on it doesn't find itself in its expression in the institution at all. Now, the institution can be helpful, but part of its helpfulness is getting out of the way. So even just doing what we're doing here breaks the pattern. So we don't need institutional reform. What we need today is disruptive innovation. We should be heckling the institutions. We should be snapping at their heels. If we're in institutions, we should be figuring out how we can patrol the borderland between the institution and the free life of the people we love and care about, so they can have a life, not a service. Doesn't mean they shouldn't have a service when they need it, but what we're trying to do, I think, is have a conversation about putting service back in its place, in service, and putting life where it belongs as the new front end. And I think that's disruptive. So the only way we're going to get to that is not reforming our systems, but finding a way of pushing our systems back so we can create some space for this conversation. And that means mischief making. It means disruption. It means having parties instead of meetings. It means having conversations instead of having strategic plans. You know that Excel spreadsheets are the vortex into which all innovation disappears. I know somebody somewhere has an Excel spreadsheet about self-directed support. Put it away. It's not going to change anything. So I'm really pleased to have a little bit of space to play with some of this stuff, really, and be disruptive. Let me put this down for a second. So I come from Limerick, which is in the west of Ireland. And I mean, I'm out of Limerick a long, long time, it has to be said. But I was raised in Limerick. And Limerick is a city that not too many people know outside of Limerick, outside of Ireland particularly. So I have found that when I talk with audiences around the world, I say, how many people know of Limerick? Actually, most people don't. But if I say, how many people have seen the movie or read the book Angela's Ashes? Quite a few, a lot more, say yes. And in the opening paragraph of Angela's Ashes, there's a wonderful, almost disturbing, but wonderful paragraph where Frank McCourt, the author of the book, says, there was only one thing worse than being an Irish Roman Catholic child in the Irish context, and that was being an Irish Roman Catholic in Limerick. Right? And I think what he was trying to point to is that the people in Limerick had a really negative view of themselves and a really negative view of the city. Still to this day, you wouldn't need to be more than 10 minutes in the city and you'll hear somebody use a negative description of the city, like Stab City is how it's regularly described. And yet, when I grew up in Limerick, I had a completely different experience of the city. And it was an experience that was very much grounded and mediated through my grandmother, who was a community connector, a very, very natural community connector. And I think she understood something that I'm only really coming to understand now. And that's this, that if you create any kind of a negative sense of a community, then eventually over time the people who live in that community, particularly the most vulnerable people, the most excluded people in that community, start to internalize that map of the place and start to believe that not alone about their community, but also about themselves. Now, I grew up, fortunately, with an antidote to what most people were saying in terms of the negativity. And that antidote was my grandmother, who could show me the power of community. But not everybody does, right? So I've been spending an awful lot of time thinking about that. You know, if you grow up and you live all of your life with a map that says communities are unsafe places, they're hostile places, they're unwelcoming places, right? Particularly if you are seen or you see yourself as different. If you're somebody who recognizes your life experience from the edge of community rather than the center. If you think about yourself as the out group rather than the in group. You know what I mean? And that's what I'm really, really interested in. How do we do something about building community that acknowledges, for a lot of people, community isn't a very welcoming place? If you go into a sociology department and you ask for a definition of community, I guarantee you one thing, you'll never leave. Because it's one of those words that's meaningless and absolutely brimming with meaning. But the one thing we all know is that community defines a group of related people. And the challenge with community is this. Every community, by definition, therefore, has boundaries. There's a perimeter around it. And that means there are those that are inside the boundary and those that are outside the boundary. So when we talk about one community, I think what we have to recognize is there isn't one community. There are millions of communities of diversity, of opinion, of voice. And what we've got to try to do is figure out how we can work with that mosaic. How we can begin to not alone grow communities with the folk that are pretty able and willing and confident about growing communities, but also the people who are at the edge. See, I think an awful lot of today's discussion is about growing community where the community has a welcome for the stranger at the edge. A lot of people these days talk about you measure the strength of a community by resilience. I think you measure the strength of a community by its capacity to welcome people from the edge into the center. Not because they're needy, not because we're good, charitable folk, but because we recognize we cannot do without the gifts of those people. That the only way we can move from being a neighborhood of strangers that are more statistically likely to be watching an episode of the American sitcom Friends than making friends with the people who live next door to us is to actually figure out that we don't live in communities. We live in neighborhoods where we might know the person one door up or two doors up from us, or the person that gets into their car at the same time across the street that we nod at. But we don't live in communities yet. So there's a job of work to be done in growing our communities of place, which has effectively been neglected. And I think the reason that it's been neglected in Europe is because we have been so focused over the last 20 years at trying to be helpful. So what we have done over 20 years in Europe, and I don't know if it's like this around here, but certainly in most parts of Europe, is we've gone into neighborhoods and we've tried to identify the people in those neighborhoods that are most in need of our services, right? I call it tangerinizing, where you go in and you just break the neighborhood into segments like a segment of a tangerine. So you have the youth at risk. That term really drives me crazy. What does youth at risk mean? I have 5 boys, right? 5 sons. And, you know, I mean, technically, I guess they're all at risk, particularly having a father like me, but they're also at promise. And yet we have a society that's organized around thinking we can be helpful by taking youth at risk, whatever that means, and aggregating them together with other youth at risk, and somehow we've convinced ourselves that, as a consequence, they'll be less at risk. We've done that with lots of groups. We've done it with the ex-prisoners, the ones that are lucky enough to return back to communities. Okay? We've done it with the frail elderly. We're really concerned about lonely people now. So we're aggregating all the lonely people. I was at a community event the other day where somebody told me about how they were organizing a lonely lunch. Funny thing is, nobody's coming. So we're trying to pull people, and we're sort of say, you've got the same label as that other person. Why don't you come in? Because they'll get you. It'll be really safe there. You won't feel excluded there. They're not going to be hostile because they kind of understand your world. So come on, that's warm and that's cozy. You can come and, you know, sit on the chairs that old people sit on in homes. You know, they're always the same. It's like they must all be sourced from the same catalog. And we'll sing the same songs. And yet when I sit with older people, they say, I don't want to be surrounded by other older people. So I think 20 years on, the legacy that we've created for ourselves in the name of being helpful is a legacy of segregation. We now find ourselves in Europe in a situation where our young people and our old people are the most age-segregated grouping of people in the history of Europe. Other people use stronger words like apartheid, but segregation will do. And yet here we are today, plotting a course of disruption that says we're not going to be trapped by our own story. We'll acknowledge it, we may even learn from it, but we're not going to be trapped by it. We're moving on. And I think part of moving on is recognizing that the solution isn't in moving away from the neighborhood, because that's what we did. We didn't just segregate people. We also said, you know, the neighborhood is not a place that welcomes you. So we're going to take you from the place, and we're going to put you in minibuses, and we're going to drive you to a place that does welcome you. There's another word for that. It's called exile. And we're going to send you to the edge where institutions who are qualified and credentialed, they're the experts, right? They know what to do. They're going to look after you. So we're also saying that's not going to be part of the next script, right? We're writing a different script today. So we're not going to segment our neighborhoods, and we're not going to exile the people that we think are different, and we're not going to aggregate them together. I think the other thing that we're not going to do is we're not going to provide programs for people that we think have problems. So what are we going to do? Well, this is where I think ABCD is really, really useful. Elizabeth Moss Cantor beautifully said that when you do change two people, they experience it as violence. But when people do change themselves, they experience it as liberation. So I think at the heart of an asset-based way of thinking is this radical idea that people can self-determine their own change, that they can be the change they seek if they can get in relationship with other people. So in a way, there's an interesting dilemma in the words self-directed, isn't there? Because I don't know how you can direct yourself except in relationship with other people who are also trying to figure out what a good life might look like. We are social beings. There's a real danger that self-directed support becomes lonely support. How do we get to interdependency rather than independency? How do we get to collective control rather than just personal control? That's where I think ABCD is really useful. So let me share with you some of what we're learning about how you grow communities of interdependence that have a welcome for the stranger at the edge. In fact, say we cannot be a community without the gifts of the people at the edge. Back in the late 1980s, John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, both at the time professors at Northwestern University in Chicago, where I'm a faculty member, and their observation was that most people in the professional world, if they had an interest in neighborhoods or communities, the interest was primarily in what was wrong with the neighborhood. So if they were academics, they wanted to study what was wrong. If they were into social care or health care, they wanted to fix what was wrong. And John and Jody recognized that that in itself was problematic. That part of what blocks people from having a life of their own choosing is they live in a world which is so obsessed with the focus on what's wrong rather than a focus on what's strong. So what they wanted to do, because they were academics, was they wanted to prove that, in fact, even in communities that are experiencing crushing poverty and all kinds of exclusion, all kinds of challenge, that there are, in fact, capacities and resources that are absolutely essential to creating economic prosperity, health, and social change. So they spent 4 years on a little bit of an odyssey. I should probably stand up here so everyone can read my lips. And over that 4-year period, they traveled across some 20 cities in North America. So that's the US and Canada, essentially. And they spent time in 300 neighborhoods in these cities. And essentially what they wanted to know, I think, is really useful for what we're trying to understand today. So their inquiry was, what happens in neighborhoods, in places, at street level, when regular uncredentialed folk get together to create welcome, create hospitality, make things better? And there are two ways of knowing things in this world, right? One is through studies, and the other is through stories. Studies result in more data. Studies inspire movements, stories inspire movements. So one of the things that I think would be really useful for us in this conversation to pay attention to is, what are the stories that are going to inspire the movement? So as they listened, what they listened for were stories, and they asked this regular question over and over again in the 300 neighborhoods they were. They said, can you tell us a story about a time that you and your neighbors came together to make things better? And you define what better is, but could you tell us a story about that? And they gathered some 3,000 of these stories together, and what was really remarkable was when they sat down and they looked at the stories, these 3,000 stories, they started to see that there was quite a lot of common ground. That these stories were telling them something, and now telling us something, about the secret ingredients to growing a place of belonging and welcome and self-direction. So I'd like to share those with you, because what's significant is, since the late 80s, we have been repeating that appreciative inquiry, that conversation at neighborhood level, all over the world. So from Stockholm to Sligo, people say the same thing to us. They tell us that if you imagine that communities are like cakes, right? They tell us that there are 6 ingredients to baking a cake where everybody can get in on the action. And the first ingredient is like the flour in the cake. I'm using pictures because I decided this morning not to use a slideshow, so you'll forgive me for using imagery, but I think it's helpful. So the flour in the cake is people. And that's kind of obvious, but that's not the full description. In every story of social change, wherever we go, at the heart of the story, at the very center of the story, are people who are defining themselves not by what they receive, but by what they can contribute. And this is really, really important. In a consumer society that says your greatest value is your ability to buy something in the marketplace, right? So even if you don't have money, if you're poor, it doesn't matter, because your value is we can provide programs to you. So you still have value. And yet what the stories were telling us is the people who make change happen are not people who define themselves by what they receive from outside agencies, but by what they can contribute to their neighbors. That in some way, that's where freedom and power and agency and real life happens. When I can take my gifts, maybe I don't even know what they are, but I can somehow reveal them, take them from being invisible and making them visible. And that's the great act of revelation. And share them, because a gift is not a gift until it's given, right? I have this awful habit of buying gifts throughout the year and storing them up for Christmas time. I hate going shopping, so I kind of order them from catalogs. And I kind of hide them in a storage cupboard that all the kids now know, you know. So we spend the entire year trying to keep them away from the storage cupboard. And recently, one of my younger kids said, Dad, give us a look. And I said, no, they're gifts. He said, Dad, a gift's not a gift until it's given. But it's also not a gift until it's received. And a lot of the people that we care about and that we love are people who have huge gifts to give, but don't have communities to receive those gifts. So something about self-directed support is also about self-directed reception. It's got to be reciprocal. It's got to be two-way. And therefore, to have a self, I must have a community. So at the heart of building communities of welcome, we need to be looking for people who are able to define themselves by their gifts and their contribution, both in terms of the gifts they have to give and also their willingness to receive their gifts. I have a name for that person, and we do too. And the name is citizen. This is the name that sociologists and political theorists have given us. And it's the opposite of another word, and that word is client. Client comes from an old Greek derivative, which means to be on your back and powerless. A supine, down on the luck, dedicated, dependent person. I am not a client, I'm a citizen. Now, what we're talking about today is citizenship, isn't it? This idea that actually everybody gets to define themselves as a citizen. And at the heart of that is about contribution. So in every story, the flower and the cake was people giving their gifts, sharing their gifts, making contribution. The second building block, the second ingredient in this cake, is the ingredient that allows me to take my individual gift and somehow to amplify it and multiply it. And the way of doing that in the world that we live in is by being in what's called association. Connecting with other folk who share a passion, share an interest, and actually are prepared to do something. So if I'm passionate about playing poker on Friday night, I can't play poker unless there are other people to play poker with. It'd be a pretty sad game. You can't have a choir if you're on your own. So associational life is hugely important, and I think in the disability movement, whatever that means, it's probably the space we paid least attention to. In every single neighborhood, there are hundreds of associations, of informal social networks that don't think about themselves as having any relationship to people who have particular labels. They just think, we're a book reading club. You know the book reading clubs that we all have in our neighborhoods that never, ever read a book? You know those ones? Or the knit and natter groups. Where I'm from, we call them stitch and bitch, right? The groups that actually come together without any constitution, they don't have a secretary or a chairperson or a treasurer. They'll probably never, ever apply for lottery funding. But somehow, in this free space, they do stuff, all kinds of stuff, that's just about having a life. And what we've discovered is, in every single one of those groups, bar a few, there is a place of welcome waiting to be tapped into. But most people in the professional world do not actually look into associational life because it doesn't seem relevant to their program. Across our neighborhoods, the one thing I think we're missing most of all are community builders who are actually intentionally building relationships. So that second building block, or that second ingredient of the cake, I think is critical. How many people know of the men's shed movement in Australia? You're an Australian man, and you've got a little shed down at the end of your garden with some tools, and typically on a Saturday or Sunday, you fix things up that need fixing, if there's something that needs fixing. Now, because typically you're just fixing whatever's in your house, you're not terribly busy, so, you tip away. And one day, maybe over a few beers, you discover there's lots of other men who are doing pretty much the same thing as you. And you kind of come up with this radical idea of, why don't we just all share one shed, put all our tools in one shed, and tell the wider community that if they have something that needs fixing, they can bring it to us. So it's as simple as that. Interestingly, in Adelaide and Sydney and Melbourne and all kinds of places, these folks, not talking to each other, started pretty much in or around about the same time creating these men's sheds. It's often the way social movements pop up, right? They're not prescribed, they just pop up. But they were popping up all over the place to such an extent that, people who pay attention to these things, particularly in the academic world, were saying, this is a social phenomenon. And particularly in public health, there was a lot of interest. And the reason there was a lot of interest is because apparently men are hard to reach. So apparently we're hard to reach, particularly when it comes to our health. And also we're pretty reckless when it comes to our health as well. Now I'm teasing this, but it's also kind of true, okay? Yet, these men in these men's sheds were living longer. So folk in public health were really curious about that. They said, we got to study this, right? This is really important. We have to understand this. So they sent out armies of researchers to interview these men, So they talked with them. They tried to understand what was happening. And they discovered that, who knew? When men are in association, in connection with each other, they live longer. They're happier. They also discovered, apparently, a man will talk about anything if he's got a power tool in his hand. So here's where it becomes problematic, right? You know what happens after a study? What happens after a study is a report is written, and of course, if it's written by an academic, it's a very erudite, very important report. And at the end of the report, you have lots and lots of recommendations, right? So basically, the report says, you know what, this is actually really, really significant. We need to pay attention to this. This is a radical public health solution, and we would recommend that the federal government fund this. It's the kiss of death, right? So the federal government starts funding all of these men's sheds, and what happens? What was a movement that was growing, hundreds and hundreds of these things just popping up all over Australia, stopped. And the numbers started reducing. Primarily because the rules and the regulations that come with funding made it into something other than the men wanted it to be. Here was something that was free, that was fun, that was about their passion, about what they love to do, that was directed by them and their community, and now it's a program, right? And this happens over and over again. We program associational space. So many of us, in an effort to try to promote inclusion for the people we love and care about, try to engage with community. How many of you have community engagement programs? Right? Lots of people, I'm guessing. You may not call them that. But effectively, the narrative is, let's get the community to welcome the people that we're encouraging to live in the community. It's called community engagement, pretty much. But it's our agenda. We're driving the agenda. And I think the challenge is, how can we, instead of driving the agenda, actually pay attention to what's already happening in communities? Find out what are the associations in community. And then, in an ambient kind of way, find a way of brokering the connections that's human, that's not programmatic. And I think we find that very hard to do because so many of us in the professional world are actually so distant from communities. So I think that second ingredient is really important because associations are where the people we love and care about can take their individual gifts and connect them with their neighbors so that they can amplify and multiply. And that's where people experience freedom and experience control and experience power. That's where your agency grows. It doesn't grow on a therapist's chair, it grows in community. The third building block, and I think this is really significant, that we discovered in all of the stories, were institutions that behaved in a kind of odd or funny way. Most institutions are inward-looking and are focused on their own self-interest, their own survival. That's kind of the way institutions are organized. They kind of look like triangles where you have a CEO at the top, at the peak of the triangle, and lots of people doing what the CEO tells them to do. So institutions are organized so that the few can control the many, and you get an efficient, standardized kind of service that we can commission or that we can procure if we don't have it ourselves. That's the way institutions are organized, right? But we discovered in talking with communities that there were some institutions and some professionals who didn't get that memo and were actually breaking the rules. And instead of organizing themselves in that way, they had started to organize themselves the way people were organizing their lives. So, for example, in Seattle city government realized that they had 32 different departments, from, the sanitation department to the parks department to social care to health and so on. And they say, people don't live their lives like this. People don't live their lives by function or by silo or by department. They live their lives in the round. So they started to wonder about how they could organize local governments. Anybody here from local government? Welcome. So they wanted to organize their local government the way people organize their lives, not expect people to organize their lives the way they were organized. Do you notice how we do that? We expect people, when they're most vulnerable, when they're most at the edge, to organize their lives the way we've organized our services. Well, Seattle city government said, what would happen if we organized the way people organize their lives? And they concluded that most people, even in disconnected neighborhoods, organize their lives by neighborhood. So they decentralized. They set up a department of neighborhoods, which became the clearinghouse for all of the other departments. That's how they got integration. That's how they got join-up. You know this amazing word that we use all the time, integration. We're going to have integrated, wraparound, coordinated services, which is code for lots and lots of triangles running around. And yet what they said is actually what we need to figure out is how can we become like a treasure chest? Because at the moment, we're kind of like a fortress wall. That when people are most vulnerable, they have to climb over. Do they fit our criteria? Do they fit into our categories? And so they changed that. So that's the third recipe, or the third ingredient, of a community cake. Institutions that are using their supportive functions to build community. And I think this really, really matters. Most institutions are not really interested in building community. Most institutions are interested in building programs. And I think this is radical, and I think we have to pay attention to it. Institutions are designed to provide services to clients. In the same way that the steel industry needs iron ore, institutions need people's needs. I would argue, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that in fact, we may need people's needs more than they need our services. Because what are we if we don't have clients who need our services? We are people working towards our own redundance. That's what this agenda is about. That's what it's about today. We are here to have a discussion about our redundancy. Wow. That's scary. And it's also hugely exciting. And actually, we have to accept the ambivalence. And we have to wrestle with the ambivalence, and we have to, in a mature, adult way, have the conversation. Because unless we surface that ambivalence and we talk about it, it will come out in all kinds of funny behavior. Resistance, lip service, active hostility. sabotage. But it's only when we actually talk about it, reassure people, give people a sense that even though we're working towards our own redundancy, there are also other functions and roles that we can play that are equally important and maybe even more so. If we don't figure this out, we will become part of the problem, not part of the solution. So understanding how we become institutions that disrupt the status quo, professionals that actually start with the question, what would a citizen do? Before we start with the question, what would a professional do? I think that's critical. The other ingredients that I'd mention before I close and take some questions is the ingredient that everything plays out in, and that's the ingredient of the place. I think an awful lot of social movements, whether it's around disability or around women's movements or around civil rights or whatever it might be, really suffer from a focus on their own particular area. They both are advantaged by it and they suffer from it. The advantage is you focus. The disadvantage is you elementalize. So you cut off the reality, and the reality is we live lives in the round. So one of the ways of getting around that or getting over that is to recognize that places, communities, are the most fertile ground for self-directed support and for a life of connectedness. We can talk about having circles of support. We can talk about having mates and friends. They're really important. But if we want long-term, enduring change that doesn't require us constantly shoring up the program, then we have to get serious about growing communities of hospitality. Because we've got two options in society today. We can either have more hospital beds or more hospitable communities. We need both, I guess. But I prefer the hospitable communities to be at the front end, please, for my life, and I'm sure you're the same. So how do we do that? Well, we do it. We just start investing. And I think part of that is recognizing that place matters, that there are many institutions that are not in the room today that could really be our radical partners, who would happily sit and have conversations with us. Public health nurses, local bobbies, or whatever you call them locally, I don't know. Folk who really get the idea that part of being a public servant or a third sector support worker or whatever is that I work at the local level to help people get connected, not to my program, but to each other. So we have an army of people in neighborhoods who would sit down with us and would actively have that conversation. But because up to quite recently, places and neighborhoods weren't our focus, programs and target groups were, we've missed that fertile ground. I said at the beginning of my presentation, we're not going to get trapped with our history. So this isn't a criticism, it's just a critique. It's something we need to pay attention to and leave behind, learn from and move on. But focusing on working in place is going to be critical to the inclusion agenda in Europe going forward. And what's fantastically exciting about it is how quickly you get results when you work in place. All over the UK now, and well, all over the UK is slightly grandiose, but certainly in 10 different parts of the UK, I'm working and we have what we're calling learning sites, neighborhoods that are beginning to figure out how they can become places of hospitality. And I'm really struck by how within 18 months, just putting one community builder into a neighborhood with 3,000 people is radically changing the lives, not just of the most vulnerable, but of everybody. We are tapping in to a huge reservoir of giftedness, of potential, of assets that were not being tapped into using the old method of engagement. Because the old method of engagement said, form a group, look at your funding criteria. If you fit our criteria, write a funding application, and we'll fund you to employ a professional and run a program. That was the old way. But we're scripting a new way. We're scripting our way, which is going to fundamentally follow only one rule. And that rule is break all the old rules. Because we're not going to get to where we need to get to by following the rules. The rules have gotten us to where we are now. They will not get us to where we need to get to. So one of the things that really strikes me is that paying attention to neighborhoods and just putting some resource into neighborhoods creates a huge dividend. The other thing that strikes me is how much resistance there is to that. And I think one of the main reasons is when I sit down in each neighborhood and I actually look at what's happening, what I see happening is a proliferation of programs, not a proliferation of community. I see sometimes in so-called low-income communities, I see people arguing about where they feature in the rank of deprivation. It's like they're comparing, it's like a reverse beauty contest where you get rewarded for your ugliness, your misery. Look how miserable we are. We're more deserving of funding. Crazy, perverse scenario, all in an effort to try and help people be empowered. We ask people to talk about their disempowerment, their misery. So we have all of these maps of misery. How many people in the last number of years have done a needs analysis of somebody they work with or a community? Most of you have. It's how we get paid, right? So what we do, we engage with people and we find out what's broken, what's problematic, what are your needs? Most of our strategies are predicated on find out what the person's needs are and then figure out a way of addressing those needs, right? One of my key messages today is that the only thing that needs analysis is needs analysis. We don't need to start with people's needs. We need to start with people's gifts, their passions, their resources, their assets. Communities and people are like football matches, where you've got 22 people who least need the exercise doing all the work, and 3,000 people who most need the exercise telling them what to do. But we're not going to change that reality by getting those 3,000 people to play football. We're only going to change that reality by taking care to find out what it is they care about enough to act upon, and then enabling them to get into connection to do it. And the way of doing that is actually the fifth ingredient. And the fifth ingredient is exchange. It's creating relationships that are based on reciprocity, not based on need and somebody's service. The problem with needs analysis is we're not doing needs analysis at all. What we're doing is we're asking, does that person fit our categories, our service categories? So we confuse people's needs with our service categorizations. You see, in the final analysis, nobody can know what they need until they first know what they have. This weekend, most of you will go and do a shop, right? What's the first thing you do before you leave your house and you go and do a shop? You check to see what's in the press, right? If you've ever done a shop having not done that, you know, if you do a shop on a bit of a sugar craze, you kind of get how bad an idea that is. We have run the public sector in this country for the last 20 years on a sugar craze. We have basically said, oh, don't worry about your assets, forget your assets, we're not even interested in them. In fact, conceal them. We will punish you if you've got assets. We'll only resource and reward your misery. That's all we're interested in. Why? Because we need your needs. We don't need your assets. Your assets push us one step closer to our redundancy. God, we don't want that. But actually we do. So what I'm suggesting to you is that if we're charting a course towards self-directed support, we are starting from a different place. We are starting with an asset inventory, not a needs assessment. Doesn't mean that we won't get to people's needs. Of course we will. But we'll get there with them. Because you see, if somebody says to me, yeah, of course you've got a problem, but you know you're the primary investor in the solution to that problem, and actually you can shape what that problem looks like, what are you going to use to address that problem, and how can I help you? That's a whole very different conversation to just tell me what you need, and I'll have a look at what's in my kit bag of services, and I'll pull out one that fits you. And I would suggest not everybody, but for the most part, lots and lots of people have had that experience until now. And so while they may not have been institutionalized in the old classic gray-walled sense, they have been institutionalized in the programmatic sense. So I think we are still in the era of deinstitutionalization. And what we're moving into is the era of recommunalization. And to get there, we need to move beyond the narrative of self and of individual and get to the narrative of us and interdependency. The sixth and final ingredient that I'd pay attention to is stories. Martin Luther King stood at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and he shared this vision. He said, "I have a dream today." He didn't write that, by the way. And 250,000 people gathered at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And I think most of us in social change movements pay attention to Martin Luther King at the podium. We think that all social change is predicated on the "I have a dream" speech. And the truth of the matter is it's not at all. It's predicated on those 250,000 people who decades before, in small, invisible ways, formed connections and relationships and used a little bit of what they had and got it connected with a little bit of what their neighbors had. And inch by inch, sometimes working 2 and 3 jobs to make ends meet, crushed under the oppression of racist hatred, made change happen. So small, so imperceptible that we miss it. Because it's so much easier to focus on the "I have a dream" podium. But all social change, including the social change that you seek here today, happens in small, little ways, to the corner of our eyes, behind our back, when individuals get connected, not on the basis of their deficits, but on the basis of their assets. So in the final analysis, the revolution, which I think is what we're about today, that you seek, will only fully come about when people who have been defined as the problem secure the power to redefine the problem. So on with the revolution. Thank you.